This video will be covering Chapter 2 in Biology for Year 8 about the ecosystem processes. So we're following the Activate 2 textbook specification, and then here we will spend a whole page just looking at the overview and about the different things that you need to know from this chapter. So there were different things that you need to know. First of all is about what the plants actually need to grow, what do they do actually in photosynthesis, and what is the relationship between photosynthesis to aerobic respiration and also anaerobic respiration. Then we'll also talk a little bit more about the ecosystem in general, some of the key terms, for example, interdependence and the food chains and food webs. So it kind of covers all of that, right? But we're going to start with the plants, the leaves itself. So first of all, let's think about the different characteristics that leaves have. So first of all, they have chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is the green pigment inside the chloroplast, which is a part of a plant cell. And the key thing that they do is that they absorb the sunlight. So after they absorb the sunlight, they can actually do the photosynthesis process. Another thing about leaves is that they are also quite thin. And if they're thin, it's easy for them to do diffusion. So it's easy for the gases to actually move across or throughout the leaves. So remember that photosynthesis needs carbon dioxide, and they make the oxygen so that they can actually go somewhere else. Third thing about the leaves is that they have quite a large surface area, and if they have a large surface area, they can absorb more light. So if you've got a plant with smaller leaves, they can absorb less sunlight, so they won't be able to do photosynthesis as well as a plant with larger leaves. They also have veins, and what we mean by that is actually vessels. So what they do is there are two types of vessels, two types of veins. We got the xylem and the phloem, and the idea is that they can transport useful substances around the body, and specifically it's about transporting the water, the minerals, and also sugars around the particular plant. So these are some of the characteristics that leaves have to help them do a good job in terms of making sure they can do photosynthesis. So before actually going to photosynthesis, let's have a think about what other things the plants need to grow well. So actually, plants, they will need different mineral ions. As I mentioned earlier, that the xylem is actually, apart from transporting water, they can also transport mineral ions. And mainly they would find it in the soil. So being a good farmer, you will want to make sure that your soil is good for growing healthy crops. They will actually sometimes put the fertilizers into the soil. And actually fertilizers are chemicals fertilizers contain these different types of mineral ions. So what are these mineral ions, right? So there are 4 mineral ions here. We've got the nitrates, first of all, which can also be absorbed by the roots and the root hair cells, and they're needed to actually nitrates are very important to make in making proteins. And if they can make proteins, that means they can grow well, because proteins are needed for structures in the plants and also other sort of different mechanisms. They can also absorb phosphates in the soil, and phosphates are important in actually in growing healthy roots. So they are important in root growth. Another mineral ion they can also absorb is potassium ions. And potassiums are very, very important in actually growing healthy leaves. And then the last one that they also absorb will be magnesium. And magnesium is particularly important, magnesium ions, because they are crucial they're very, very important in making the green chlorophyll. So if you don't have enough magnesium in the plant, then your plants would start having yellow leaves, which means they are not as good at absorbing sunlight, therefore they can do less photosynthesis, meaning they can have less food. So these are the 4 different mineral ions that the plant actually would need to grow better. And all of them, once they've been absorbed in the roots, they can then travel up into the plant through the xylem as well. And like I said, apart from the mineral ions that the xylem actually transport. They also transport the water, which can be absorbed by the roots as well in this process. And then all of them will go up this way in the xylem, right, which is the vein, then go up and then all around the different parts of the leaves so they can do photosynthesis. So imagine if we zoom into a leaf and look at its cross section, then actually this is what it looks like. So we got the upper epidermis, which is the top surface of the leaf, and the lower epidermis, which is the bottom of the leaf. There are four key structures I would like to draw your attention to. First of all is this first top layer, right, this layer here. That is called the palisade layer. And these cells are called the palisade mesophyll cells. And then we've got the bottom layer here, which is called the spongy layer. And the reason why it's called the spongy layer is because it's got lots more air spaces in it. So first of all, the palisade layer. The palisade layer is made up of the palisade mesophyll cells. And the palisade mesophyll cells are quite regular in terms of the shape. They would line up on the tops, near the top of the surface of the leaf. And one key thing is that they have lots and lots of chloroplast and lots of chlorophyll inside there as a result. So actually that's why we say the palisade cells, or the palisade layer, is the site for photosynthesis. This is where photosynthesis actually takes place. We'll come back to photosynthesis in a bit. For the spongy layer, because they have a lot more air spaces inside, therefore they can actually allow the gases to actually move around. So like we said, the carbon dioxide then can come in, and then the water and the oxygen can come out of the leaf. And as to these particular structures here, right, so we got the guard cells, and the guard cells basically control the opening and the closing of the stomata. And the stomata is literally referring to the hole inside here. Or if it's singular, it's just simply called the stoma. So the stoma is the hole between the guard cells, which allow things to go in and out. So kind of like our nose in some sense. And the guard cells actually swell up to open it, or flattens to close it. So that is the structure of the leaf. So now we'll go into a little bit more detail about how photosynthesis actually occurs. We'll look at the actual chemistry behind it. So photosynthesis has got this chemical equation. So carbon dioxide plus water would make glucose and oxygen. So carbon dioxide and water would react together using the energy from the sunlight through the chlorophyll that the chlorophyll absorbed, and then change its structure to make glucose, which is the food for the plant. So let's have a very quick think about where they actually get these different substances. Right, so carbon dioxide is basically from the atmosphere, from the air around it. So because of the stomata here, the carbon dioxide can come into the leaves from the surrounding area, and then that's literally it, because that's where the photosynthesis happens, right? And then the water mainly comes from the soil. As we mentioned earlier, the water is absorbed by the roots, and they can be carried up in the xylem and into the leaves, and then they react together in the palisade cells using the light energy from absorbed by the chlorophyll, and then changing it into glucose and oxygen. Now for the glucose, like I said, it's basically food for the plant, but what is really important to think about is why do plants actually need food? Because they don't actually need to move like us, so what do they need the food for? So then we'll come back to this in a bit. So the oxygen have got two different things could happen. So first of all, it could be released to the environment, but actually quite a lot of them, together with the glucose, will enter the next particular chemical reaction, which is aerobic respiration. Now, first of all, let's have a very quick think about what is aerobic respiration, right? Aerobic respiration is a chemical reaction which breaks the glucose down to release energy. Right, so that is what respiration is, but we've got two different types, but we'll think about aerobic first. Now aerobic, think about the chocolate arrow. So it's got lots, it's about how it's reacting with air or reacting with oxygen. So aerobic means with oxygen, and it releases quite a lot of energy. So obviously plants would need it for various reasons, and animals need it. So let's think about in terms of animals. So we need the energy, first of all, to move. Right? The fact that you can move around and run around is because you've got energy from the food that you eat. You also need energy to grow For example, growing your muscles. For the plants will be growing proteins, growing their stems, growing their leaves, growing their flowers. In animals, there's another one, to keep ourselves warm. Right, so our body temperatures, especially for mammals, we are what we call the warm-blooded animals, the endotherms, and we actually do aerobic respiration, and that keeps our body temperature at about 36 to 37 degrees Celsius. So that's why we need to do aerobic respiration. If you're not doing respiration, you're probably dead. Right? So we are always doing respiration, even when we are asleep. Now, aerobic respiration happens in our mitochondria. So remember that both animals and plant cells contain mitochondria, and it's because both animals and plants do aerobic respiration for energy for various things. So what is the equation for aerobic respiration? And actually it is the exact opposite to the photosynthesis, just in the opposite direction. So we'll just write it out here. Glucose plus oxygen makes carbon dioxide and water. So same thing, let's have a think about where do we actually get these things. So I'm going to talk about this in terms of animals or in terms of humans. Right, so glucose, first of all, comes from our food. So once we eat the food, it's digested in our stomach and in our small intestines, and we absorb it into our bloodstream. And then it is carried to different cells by what we call the blood plasma. So the blood, as you would know, is was basically a liquid. And actually we say that it is a liquid because 55% of blood is this yellowy, watery liquid, which is called the plasma. Then the other 45% of it is then the red blood cells, white blood cells, and other things as well. Then the oxygen, for us, we simply breathe it in, right? So it's from the air around us. And again, it is also carried by the blood, but specifically it is carried by the hemoglobin, which is a specific protein inside the red blood cells. So we got oxygenated blood is because, so oxygenated blood looks red because the hemoglobin will turn red if it's got oxygen bound to it, but it will turn to this darker purple color if it doesn't have oxygen bound to it. So it's carried by this hemoglobin protein inside our red blood cells. Then once it's in our cells, in our mitochondria, they do this reaction to release energy for us to do various things, and then they would make the carbon dioxide and the water. And the carbon dioxide and the water will both be breathed out. And we know how that works, which is basically, again, once our cells made it, it's then carried in the bloodstream again by the plasma to the alveoli. And once it gets the alveoli in the lungs, we can then exchange it with the oxygen coming in, and then we release it to the environment around us. Another thing that water can also be used is, well, basically absorbed by the cell. So it can be used by the cell because, well, we need to stay hydrated. So actually that's a really good product that we made from respiration, apart from the energy that is released. The thing is, we have another type of respiration. Now sometimes, let's say if you're doing exercise or you're running away from something, you would be breathing heavier than before, and that's because your body's trying to get more oxygen into your system. So we got another type of respiration, which is called the anaerobic respiration. Your body naturally doesn't really like to do anaerobic respiration, which is respiration without the oxygen. And the reason for that is because anaerobic respiration releases only a little bit of energy, and usually it creates something that is quite nasty for our body. So it's not as nice. So actually, if we compare aerobic respiration, if it breaks down one glucose completely, it can release something like 38 units of energy. Whereas anaerobic respiration, breaking one glucose molecule down, can only release 2 units of energy. So you can see there's a massive difference there. And actually, it happens in slightly different ways in terms of in animals and in microorganisms. So in animals, the glucose is broken down into making lactic acid, and lactic acid can cause muscle fatigue or muscle cramps. So fatigue means tiredness or just extreme tiredness. So if it's really, really tired, then it would start cramping up, and it's really, really painful. But the thing is, a good thing about it is that we can break it down. So the lactic acid in our muscles can actually travel by our bloodstream to the liver, and it can be broken down with extra oxygen. And this extra oxygen that we've got, that we need actually to break this down, is what we called oxygen debt. Because it's almost like you've just broken down a glucose molecule without using oxygen, so that was a debt that you now need to pay or need to fulfill to make sure that you can fully break that glucose down. So by breaking it down, then we will no longer have those cramps. But at least it's useful if you're trying to get that extra energy out because you were doing exercise or you're running away from something quite dangerous. Now in microorganisms, they can also do anaerobic respiration, but this time they make something slightly different. So they make ethanol and carbon dioxide for the breakdown of the glucose. There is another name for this particular process, which is called fermentation. And actually from this name you might be able to guess how humans actually use this chemical reaction in the microorganisms to make things that we quite like. So for example, by making the microorganisms do fermentation or anaerobic respiration, we make the ethanol, which is perfect for brewing, so making alcohol, so making beer or wine, etc. We can also use yeast, for example, and when they do anaerobic respiration, they make carbon dioxide, so actually that's perfect for baking. So that's why we put it into our dough to make bread or make cakes or scones. So it's all about that carbon dioxide making the bread dough rise while we're baking it. But obviously we don't get any food poisoning when we drink wine or eat bread, because the heat from the oven for making bread or the ethanol itself can actually kill these yeast or microorganisms before we actually eat them. So that's anaerobic respiration in microorganisms as well. So, so far we've talked about what leaves have in terms of their adaptations to help them do photosynthesis. We've talked about what mineral ions the plants actually need to make them grow better. We've looked at the structure of the leaves to see how what makes them good for photosynthesis and what is photosynthesis, and also how it links into aerobic respiration in animals and plants, and then also anaerobic respiration as well. Now what we'll talk about here then, the rest of it, is about the ecosystem processes. So plants are what we call producers because they can actually do photosynthesis in making food. None of the other organisms can. And actually producers can be eaten by the herbivores. And sometimes we use an arrow to represent that, to show how the energy is being transferred. And then the herbivores can be eaten by carnivores, which eat meat. And the carnivores either can be the top predator, or if they're not the top predator yet, then they can be eaten by the top predator. So we say that actually anything that's eaten is called a prey, and anything that eats something else is called a predator. So actually if we look at this is what we call a food chain. Usually we draw it sideways, but because of the space here, I'm just going to draw it vertically going up. Sometimes we might have other branches as well, so we can have this one, which can then be eaten by the same thing, by different things, or like that. And actually at that point, we say that we've got a food web, which is basically different food chains linked together. Right, but it's pretty much the same thing, but it's better because it shows you how the entire ecosystem works. And we say all the animals and plants live in the ecosystem. And all of these different animals together, they would live in a habitat. And we say that this is what we call a community of organisms, because it's all about all the animals and plants living together in a habitat as well. And we say that all of these organisms depend on one another. So we have the phrase called interdependence, where they depend on each other. So for example, if I change one thing within this food web, then it will have a knock-on effect on the rest of them. And some of the other things, for example, would be bioaccumulation, which is about how chemicals can actually accumulate as we go up the food chain. So for example, in the early on, the small fish would have some 1 unit of toxins in it, but because of larger fish will eat all of them, then they would got a higher dosage of that toxic chemical. And if got a even bigger fish, or let's say the humans eating loads of different fish, all having high levels of toxins, then obviously as the top predator, then the human who ate all of these fishes would get a lethal or damaging dose of the toxins. So that's what we call the bioaccumulation. And we say all of this is about being in an ecosystem, because That's how all of these different organisms are interacting with each other, interdepending, so interdependence, they're depending on each other, and they all are in their individual niche, so which is talking about how they're in their own specific role in this particular thing. So this is a herbivore, then that is your role, or you're a protoperative, then you've got that role yourself as well. So this is talking about the whole ecosystem with the various different organisms, all as a community living in the same habitat. Within the community, they have their own niche, their own role, and they all depend on each other, called the interdependence. And an example of how they might affect it would be bioaccumulation, how the effect on one small little animal can have an effect on later on in the food chain.